Okay, Shvanpanim. Today we're going to discuss covert borderline with covert narcissist in a couple, in a friendship, in the workplace, but especially in an intimate relationship, interpersonal relationship. How do they cope together? How do they fit? How do they conflict? What is the outcome? How do they come together? Why do they come together? Etc., etc. And today, the whole second episode is dedicated to coverts, covert borderline versus covert narcissist. Now, just to make clear, for disclaimer sake and full disclosure, covert borderline is not an official diagnosis. You cannot find it in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It is a diagnosis that I suggested, I came up with a few years ago. Another diagnosis that I came up with many decades ago is inverted narcissist. So covert borderline is my second born diagnosis. Covert borderline is simply a hybrid between borderline and narcissist, but it's not a comorbidity. Comorbidity is a situation where we diagnose the same person with two or more personality disorders or other mental health issues. A covert borderline is an integrated structure. It's a system which borrows elements from narcissistic personality disorder and elements from borderline personality disorder, puts them together in a coherent, cohesive, self-maintaining, self-sustaining, and self-reinforcing system. So it's a hybrid, not a comorbidity. And there is no way to treat the narcissistic part of covert borderline separately to the borderline part of the covert borderline, because the covert borderline is a vertical and horizontal integration of aspects of narcissism, pathological narcissism, with aspects of classical borderline. Now, both types act out, but in very different ways. I mean, both the covert borderline and the overt, normal, classical borderline, they act out, but in very different ways. And their internal landscape, their psychology, psychodynamics are very different. That's why there was a clear need to invent or to come up with the covert borderline diagnosis. Because in clinical practice, this is something every therapist would tell you exists. It is just that academe took many decades to catch up with reality, as it usually does. So, my name is Sam Vaknin. I'm the author of Malignant Self-Love, Narcissism Revisited. I'm also a former visiting professor of psychology and currently on the faculty of CIAPS, Commonwealth for International Advanced and Professional Studies. And the video you're about to watch is based mostly on the work of Cooper, the late Arnold Cooper, and Salman Akhtar, starting in 1989 when they were the first to describe the covert or fragile or shy narcissist. So let us delve right in and use the scheme of Akhtar and Cooper applied to the covert borderline, and then try to see how the elements of covert borderline would interact with the elements of a covert narcissist. And what would it bring? What would it create? What kind of hurricane, maelstrom it will create? Start with the fact that the covert borderline is slightly antisocial, not full-fledged, not criminal, but definitely defiant, contumacious, resentful or rejecting of authority, and to some extent reckless. So these are the antisocial dimensions of covert borderline, the ones that are captured with Robert Hare's PCLR type 1, factor 1. So there is some factor 1 psychopathy involved in the covert borderline diagnosis. The covert borderline, exactly like the covert narcissist, has a false sense of grandiosity, a false self. Covert borderline perceives himself, and the majority of covert borderlines, I think, are men. The covert borderline perceives himself as this inflated, fantastic, all-knowing, all-powerful, perfect being. Maybe not godlike, like the classic narcissist, but not far from it, let's say. An authority figure, a guru, a teacher, a leader, a guide, a healer, a rescuer, a savior, the most intelligent, superior intellectually or in some other way, etc., etc. So there's a strong element of grandiosity in the covert borderline. Similarly, there's a strong element of grandiosity in the covert narcissist. But in the covert narcissist, the grandiosity is compensatory. The covert narcissist has a core of shame, a sense of inferiority and inadequacy, lack of worth, and we call this a bad object. So while the covert narcissist has a bad object, a constellation of introjects, a constellation of voices that keep informing the covert narcissist that he is not good enough, that he is a failure, that he is a loser, that he is going nowhere, that he is inadequate. The covert borderline doesn't have such a constellation of voices. The covert borderline, in other words, does not have a dominant bad object. And that is because the covert borderline succeeded to overcome the bad object. The covert borderline succeeded through, for example, accomplishments in life, to supplant the bad object, to suppress it somehow, to convert it into essentially a good object. The covert borderline's bad object emanates from childhood. These are introjects of important people in the covert borderline's life. For example, parental figures, mother, peers, and so on. So the covert borderline starts off with a bad object, but then dedicates his life to falsifying the bad object, proving to the bad object that the bad object is wrong. So ultimately, the covert borderline ends up with a good object. And in this sense, the covert borderline is very, very similar to the overt narcissist. Now, we today are reconceiving of overt, grandiose narcissism as a form of psychopathy.